Henry Winkler's character, Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz, exploded over the first couple of seasons so much.
He refuses to watch it. Not once in 50 years. In 1974, Ron Howard filmed one episode that still haunts him. He's directed Oscar-winning films, worked with Hollywood legends, and built a career most actors only dream of. But this one moment on Happy Days is something he'll never revisit. Why would one of the kindest, most respected names in Hollywood draw such a hard line? What happened in that script that struck such a nerve? You'll hear what Ron won't say publicly. We dug through interviews, behind-the-scenes records, and cast commentary to bring you the full truth. The episode Ron can't revisit. In 1974, Happy Days was just starting to become a cultural juggernaut. Audiences tuned in each week to see the affable Richie Cunningham navigate teen life in 1950s America. But for Ron Howard, one particular episode that year hit closer to home than anyone realized. The episode was called Fonzie Drops In. It aired during the show's second season, and on the surface, it seemed like just another light-hearted chapter in the sitcom's early success. But for Howard, it would become something entirely different, something he's refused to revisit for nearly 5 decades. In the episode, Richie is caught in a whirlwind of insecurity and doubt after Fonzie suddenly becomes the center of attention at Jefferson High. Fonzie, the cool, rebellious greaser in a leather jacket, starts stealing Richie's spotlight, both socially and emotionally. Girls who once swooned over Richie now orbit Fonzie. Even Richie's friends begin to idolize the Fonz's confidence, leaving Richie feeling small, invisible, and forgotten. To fans, it was a simple coming-of-age storyline, a good kid dealing with the sting of social rejection. But according to multiple crew members and writers who spoke in later interviews, something about Howard's performance was different that week. His delivery wasn't just acting, it was lived experience. And when filming wrapped, he quietly asked not to be shown the final cut. The truth is, Ron Howard was struggling during this period, emotionally and professionally. While Happy Days was a hit, he was wrestling with the uncomfortable transition from child actor to adult. For most of his life, he had been known as Opie, the sweet-faced son of Sheriff Andy Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show. Audiences had literally watched him grow up, but few understood the identity crisis that came with that. In Fonzie Drops In, Richie's quiet unraveling mirrored Ron's own internal doubts. He wasn't just playing a kid who felt replaced, he was feeling it. As Henry Winkler's Fonzie exploded in popularity, so did the pressure on Howard. He was no longer the undeniable star of the show. Behind the scenes, the network began shifting more of the spotlight to Fonzie. Suddenly, the face of Happy Days was changing, and Ron, who had carried the early weight of the show, was forced to adapt. Howard has never publicly named Fonzie Drops In as the episode he avoids. In interviews, he's careful not to assign blame or name specific episodes that haunt him. But insiders have long pointed to this one as the emotional turning point. As one former crew member once said anonymously, "That was the week Ron stopped being Richie and started being Ron." He didn't say it out loud, but we all felt it. Ron Howard has always been a private person. He's spoken often about how he doesn't like watching his own work, saying, "Frankly, I don't go back and watch my movies." But television is different, especially when you're in the scene, not just behind the camera. That episode in 1974 wasn't just a script, it was a mirror. And for someone like Howard, who thrives on growth and forward movement, watching it would feel like reopening a wound that never fully healed. Even decades later, the subject makes him pause. In a 2022 interview, he was asked if there was any episode of Happy Days he wished he could rewatch. He chuckled and said, "There's one I never want to see again. It just reminds me of a weird time." That's as close as he's come to admitting it outright. So why has he kept his distance? Because that moment on screen wasn't just Richie Cunningham being pushed aside. It was Ron Howard, for the first time in his life realizing that fame doesn't protect you from insecurity. In fact, it can make it worse. What the audience saw was a clean-cut teen reacting to rejection. What Ron felt behind the scenes was something much heavier. Growing up in the spotlight. Ron Howard didn't just grow up on screen, he grew up because of the screen. At just 6 years old, he became a household name as Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show. For most kids, early memories involve playgrounds or birthday parties. For Ron, they involved sound stages, lighting cues, and hitting his marks with perfect timing. America watched him grow, but few realized the cost of that visibility. From the outside, it looked like a dream. A child actor with a steady job on one of the most beloved sitcoms of the 1960s, working alongside Andy Griffith and Don Knotts. But behind the scenes, the demands of that job left little room for a real childhood. His father, Rance Howard, an actor and writer himself, was deeply involved in guiding Ron's career, and he took that role seriously. He wasn't a stage dad in the traditional sense, but he was vigilant. Ron later described him as loving but firm, always reminding him to be professional, polite, and prepared. Every take had to be tight. Every emotion had to feel real. By the time Ron turned 20, he had more industry experience than many veteran actors. He wasn't just learning lines, he was learning how to navigate a business that didn't allow for vulnerability. And in some ways, it showed. He became known as one of the most reliable young actors in television. He hit his cues. He nailed his blocking. He didn't cause drama. But the flip side of that reputation was something he rarely talked about. He didn't know who he was without a script. The 1974 episode of Happy Days brought that truth crashing into focus. Richie's story in Fonzie Drops In, a boy slowly losing his place in the world, was too eerily close to the life Ron was actually living. As Fonzie's character began stealing scenes and headlines, Ron found himself confronting a painful reality. The show was changing, and he was being edged out of the center. Howard was still the lead on paper, but the energy of the show was shifting. Network executives saw the audience response to Henry Winkler's Fonzie and leaned into it hard. Suddenly, Fonzie was getting more screen time, better lines, and story arcs that resonated with fans. Richie was becoming the straight man in a show that had once revolved around him. That dynamic wasn't just acting, it was life imitating art. And for someone who'd spent nearly every year of his childhood being the star, it triggered a quiet identity crisis. Ron wasn't used to being second to anyone, not because he was arrogant, but because he'd never had the chance to be anything else. His father's voice, the one that taught him to always be prepared, always be composed, started echoing louder. Rance had instilled a deep sense of responsibility in Ron to be the example, to be the one who didn't mess up, to always get it right. But in that episode, when Richie felt overshadowed and emotionally adrift, those same expectations began to feel like pressure instead of protection. For the first time in his career, Ron couldn't separate the character from the performer. And that's why the episode still haunts him. Not because it was poorly written, not because it embarrassed him. Quite the opposite, because it was so honest, so raw, so close to his own fears that watching it would feel like reliving a moment he worked hard to survive. Ron later said in an interview that being a child actor can leave you emotionally underdeveloped in some areas. You're good at pretending, but not always good at processing, he admitted. That episode forced him to process more than he was ready for. It wasn't just Richie having a breakdown. It was Ron facing the parts of his life he hadn't had time to examine. And that's when Ron made a private decision. He'd never watch that episode again. Not because it was bad, because it was too good. The burden of perfection. Ron Howard is often described as the nicest guy in Hollywood. Humble, grounded, quietly brilliant. But behind that soft-spoken reputation is a deeply driven perfectionist. It's a side of Ron that fans rarely see. But those who've worked with him know it well. He doesn't yell. He doesn't throw tantrums. But he sets an invisible standard that's nearly impossible to meet. Not for others, for himself. Throughout his acting and directing career, Ron has confessed one particular flaw. He can't bear to watch his own performances, not because he's embarrassed, but because he can't stop dissecting every frame. "I don't go back and watch my movies," he told People magazine in 2024. "I've already learned what I needed to from them." That may sound humble, but it reveals something deeper. Howard isn't avoiding the work. He's avoiding the spiral. The moment he sees himself on screen, he stops being a storyteller and starts being a surgeon, picking apart the tone of his voice, the angle of his posture, the pacing of a scene. And the 1974 Happy Days episode was where that habit began. In Fonzie Drops In, the emotion Howard brought to the role was stunning. Richie's vulnerability wasn't just written, it was lived. The hesitation in his eyes, the forced smile when friends ignored him, the way he shuffled his feet in silence while Fonzie took the stage. Every gesture carried weight. Viewers saw authenticity. Ron saw mistakes. Not in the acting, necessarily, but in what it revealed about him. He didn't feel like he was performing. He felt like he was confessing. And that's where the burden of perfection hit hardest. Because when you're as experienced and talented as Ron Howard, even at 20, you know when something's too real. The kind of real that doesn't stay on the soundstage. The kind that follows you home, sits with you in silence, and asks questions you're not ready to answer. That level of honesty terrified him. Not in the moment. Ron has always been a consummate professional, but in the aftermath. When the episode aired and crew members praised his performance, he didn't feel proud. He felt exposed. Watching it again would have meant reliving that vulnerability. And for someone obsessed with moving forward and improving, there was no point in going back. This episode marked a shift. It wasn't just the last time he watched that specific performance, it was the beginning of a habit that has lasted a lifetime. Since then, Howard has largely refused to revisit any of his acting work. Even when fans ask about specific episodes or scenes, he smiles politely, gives them what they want, but never joins them in nostalgia. To him, those moments are complete. They served their purpose. The lesson was learned. Even as a director, he applies the same mindset. After a film wraps, he'll sit through test screenings, tweak edits, and read reviews. But once a project is finished, he lets it go. Not because he doesn't care, but because he cares too much. Watching it again would only lead to second-guessing, wondering if one line could have landed better, if one shot could have been tighter, if one moment could have been quieter or louder or more layered. That level of scrutiny would eat away at his creativity. So he made peace with a rule. Do the best you can in the moment. Absorb what you need from the experience, then walk away. It's why Ron Howard is still growing as an artist after more than 5 decades in the business. He's not trying to relive past victories, he's trying to evolve. And it all started with a sitcom script that pushed him to his emotional edge. A single half-hour episode that showed him the cost of being both performer and perfectionist at the same time. But the episode wasn't the only thing he refused to watch. It was the beginning of a lifelong habit. The day he left acting for good. In Hollywood, most actors spend their whole lives trying to stay in the spotlight. But Ron Howard, who had been in it since before he could tie his shoes, chose to walk away. And when he did, he didn't throw a press conference. He didn't frame it as reinvention. He didn't even say goodbye. He just disappeared from the screen. Quietly, deliberately. To fans, it was puzzling. Happy Days was a smash hit, and Ron was one of its core stars. Why would he give up everything he had worked for? Why would he stop doing what made him famous? For Ron, the answer wasn't dramatic. It was personal. He was exhausted, emotionally, spiritually, even physically. Acting didn't just tire him out. It wore him down. In interviews years later, he admitted it openly. I was more interested in the whole process than just being in front of the camera. But that wasn't the whole story. Behind that polite phrasing was a deeper truth. Acting had stopped feeling like a passion. It had started to feel like a trap. Ron Howard had never really chosen acting, not in the traditional sense. He had grown up in the industry, nudged along by a family that loved the craft and believed in his talent. His father, Rance, his mother, Jean, they were both actors themselves. Ron had been taught how to behave on set before he learned how to ride a bike. It was his world. But as he got older, he began to realize that he didn't know if it was his choice. The emotional toll of certain roles, especially ones like the 1974 episode of Happy Days, forced him to face questions he had avoided for years. Did he love acting? Or was he just good at it because he'd been doing it forever? Was he passionate about being on camera, or had he simply learned to meet expectations, to hit marks, to make other people happy? The more he asked those questions, the louder the answer became. No, he didn't love it. Not anymore. And that realization hit him like a wave. He began to see that the most exciting moments of his work weren't when he was performing. They were when he was standing off to the side, watching the way a scene was lit, how the camera moved, how the story came together piece by piece. He wasn't just an actor. He was already a director in the making. So, while Happy Days was still soaring in ratings, Ron made a quiet decision to shift focus. He started taking directing classes, shadowing professionals, writing his own scripts. While others were chasing leading roles, he was reading about lenses, editing styles, and narrative structure. By the time he left Happy Days in 1980, he was already directing low-budget projects and short films. His breakout came just 4 years later with Splash, a film that not only launched his career behind the camera, but also made it clear he wasn't coming back to acting. Ron didn't burn bridges. He didn't go on talk shows to explain himself. He simply faded from the screen and re-emerged behind it. And in doing so, he unlocked a part of himself that had been buried under decades of lines and laugh tracks. Acting, in the end, had become a kind of emotional debt. Every performance pulled from a well that Ron no longer wanted to dip into. Directing, however, was creation on his terms. It was structure, vision, leadership, without the personal cost. He once said that directing gave him a kind of peace that acting never could. "There's a freedom in seeing the big picture," he explained, "and that's where I've always belonged." To this day, aside from rare cameos and voice work, Ron Howard has never returned to full-time acting. Not because he couldn't, but because he finally realized he didn't need to. And that quiet departure became one of the most important creative decisions of his life. A director obsessed with growth. For Ron Howard, success has never been about reliving the past. It's been about outgrowing it. While many stars look back fondly on their biggest roles or directorial triumphs, Howard moves in the opposite direction. He doesn't linger. He doesn't rewatch. And he certainly doesn't romanticize. He finishes a project, absorbs what it taught him, and then lets it go like a chapter he no longer needs to reread. That mindset isn't a quirk, it's a principle. One that's helped him survive and thrive in an industry obsessed with nostalgia. In a 2019 interview, Howard said something that summed up his creative philosophy perfectly. To ignore critics would be short-sighted, but I don't need to rewatch something to grow. That single sentence reveals the heart of who Ron is, not a man running from his past, but someone determined not to be defined by it. This obsession with forward movement has shaped everything he touches. His directorial work spans nearly every genre: historical drama, Apollo 13, intimate psychological studies, A Beautiful Mind, political tension, Frost, Nixon, sci-fi, fantasy, children's movies, and even Star Wars. Each film is its own universe, and Howard treats them that way, deeply committed during the process, but never dragging the baggage of one project into another. It's why he refuses to rewatch the 1974 Happy Days episode that first cracked open something personal inside him. Because watching it would mean revisiting a version of himself he's outgrown. It wouldn't be entertainment. It would be self-confrontation. And for a man so focused on evolution, that kind of rear-view mirror glance feels more like quicksand than reflection. Even his approach to feedback is different from most in Hollywood. Some directors famously avoid critics altogether, fearing it will shake their confidence. Not Ron. He reads reviews, not right away, but eventually. After the dust has settled emotionally, he explained, I want to understand how it landed, what worked, what didn't. But once that window closes, he doesn't return. He doesn't analyze his own cuts or obsess over alternate takes. He trusts the version that exists, the version he finished. Then he walks away. This discipline, while rare, has become one of his creative superpowers. It frees him to take risks, to try new formats, to tell stories that aren't safe but ambitious. Whether it's humanizing Richard Nixon in Frost or Nixon or exploring the chaos of space in Apollo 13, Howard approaches each film as if it's the first one, stripped of ego, loaded with curiosity. He even admitted once that 4 days after wrapping one movie, he's already itching to start the next. That's not restlessness. That's vision. It's the need to evolve, to prove something, not to others, but to himself. A fire that doesn't come from insecurity, but from a deep-seated belief that growth is the only real goal. And that's why he never clings to the camera time he once had. He could have easily carved out a second career in nostalgia, talk show interviews, reunion episodes, retrospective specials. But he's not interested. He left Opie behind. He left Richie behind. Not out of resentment, but out of necessity. They were versions of him, sure, but only versions, not destinations. The 1974 episode, in particular, is part of that journey. It marked the beginning of his discomfort with being watched, and the end of pretending he loved acting just because he'd always done it. Revisiting it would be like flipping through a yearbook photo he doesn't recognize, except this one talks, cries, and reminds him of the pressure he once carried alone. So Ron keeps moving. He directs, he produces, he teaches. He watches others act and helps them find their voices. Because his voice? He's already found it. Not in dialogue, but in vision. For Ron Howard, greatness isn't a memory. It's a mountain he hasn't finished climbing. Family, fame, and the cost of being good. Ron Howard's name has long been synonymous with decency. In a town filled with egos and scandals, he's been the exception. The grounded one, the professional, the nice guy in Hollywood who always shows up prepared, respectful, and even-tempered. But what that label often misses is the invisible weight it carries. Behind the gentle smile and the calm demeanor is a man who spent his entire life trying not to let anyone down. From a very young age, Ron learned that being good wasn't just admired, it was expected. He wasn't allowed the same indulgences or outbursts other kids might get. He was working, on set, around adults, being watched. He wasn't just Ron, he was Opie, and later, Richie. He was the moral compass of two of America's most iconic shows. That image, that responsibility, didn't disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. Those close to him say it shaped everything, from the roles he took to the way he parented. His daughter, actress and director Bryce Dallas Howard, once offered a quiet but revealing comment about her father. In an interview, she said, "My dad has always prioritized the work and the people around him. Sometimes I wonder if he ever prioritized himself." It wasn't said with judgment. It was said with understanding. Because behind the success, behind Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and the countless awards, there's a quieter legacy Ron rarely speaks about. A kind of grief. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the slow-burning kind that comes from being dependable for too long. From always being the steady hand. The problem solver. The person who never melts down, never makes a scene, never becomes the story. And perhaps that's why the 1974 Happy Days episode still haunts him. Not because Richie Cunningham's arc in Fonzie Drops In was too dramatic or too sad, but because it was too familiar. In that episode, Richie feels left behind. He tries to pretend he's fine while everyone around him is changing. He hides his disappointment, makes jokes to mask the sting, and shrinks quietly as Fonzie steps into the spotlight. It's not a breakdown. It's a slow retreat into himself. That's the emotional choreography Ron had been performing for years. The script didn't ask Ron to cry. It didn't give him a big monologue. It simply required him to suppress, to put others first, to be gracious in the face of rejection, to smile while fading. And no one could play that better than Ron Howard, because no one had lived it more. He had learned, as many child stars do, that the more agreeable you are, the longer you stay in the room. That being likable kept you employed. That being difficult could end everything. So he became a master of keeping the peace, of calming tension, of stepping aside with grace. But it came at a cost. That cost didn't show up in tabloid scandals or rehab stints. It showed up in silence, in never revisiting the episode, in never publicly reflecting on what it meant to him. Because to do so would be to acknowledge something he's rarely allowed himself to explore, that being the good one doesn't mean you're unscathed. And maybe that's why he turned so quickly toward directing. Behind the camera, he could still be in control, still be the leader. But he didn't have to bare his soul. He didn't have to act out the ache. He could shape stories without being the story. The 1974 episode was never just television. It was a mirror. And what Ron saw in that mirror wasn't just a character. It was a version of himself he wasn't ready to face again. And perhaps that's why he avoids the episode, not because it's fiction, but because it wasn't. Why this story still matters. In an industry built on self-promotion, red carpets, and constant reinvention, Ron Howard is a mystery. A man who, by all accounts, should be louder about his legacy, but isn't. He's directed Oscar-winning films, shaped pop culture, mentored the next generation of storytellers, and yet he remains startlingly understated. No bloated memoir, no tell-all interviews, no emotional deep dives on talk shows, just quiet consistency, decade after decade. That restraint makes the story of the 1974 Happy Days episode even more powerful. Because, for all his modesty, for all his forward momentum, there's one piece of Ron Howard's past he cannot revisit. Not because he regrets it, but because it was too real. The episode in question, Fonzie Drops In, wasn't written as a confessional. It was just another installment in a family-friendly sitcom. But something strange happened when the cameras rolled. Something rare. The mask slipped, just for a moment. And the audience caught a glimpse not just of Richie Cunningham, but of Ron. Not the rising star, not the boy genius turned director, but the actual human being beneath the performance. The kid who'd grown up too fast. The young man unsure of where he ended and his characters began. The emotional tone of that episode, quiet disappointment, masked loneliness, the ache of invisibility, echoed truths that Ron himself had carried silently for years. It wasn't about acting. It was about accidentally revealing too much. And when that happens, when a performance becomes indistinguishable from a personal memory, it changes how you see the work. It no longer belongs to the character. It becomes part of you. That's why he's never watched it again. People often assume that artists revisit their past because they're proud, or curious, or sentimental. But Ron's refusal isn't rooted in shame or disdain. It's rooted in preservation. He's said before that he learns from his projects, takes in feedback, reads the reviews, and then moves on. It's not because he's afraid to reflect. It's because he understands something that many in his field don't. Not every moment is meant to be relived. Some scenes should live only once. That episode in 1974 was one of them. It's a philosophy that's guided his entire career. Ron doesn't chase the past. He doesn't orbit around a single success. He lets each project be its own story, its own experience. The same way he refuses to watch his early movies like Splash or Cocoon, he avoids the 1974 Happy Days episode for the same reason. He already lived it. What more is there to gain? And yet, the story still matters. Because it offers a rare crack in the carefully controlled narrative of Ron Howard's life. It shows us that even the most composed people have moments they carry quietly. It reminds us that vulnerability isn't always loud, and that sometimes the most impactful scenes are the ones we never talk about. In a world where celebrities overshare, Ron's silence says more. He didn't need to turn that episode into a career-defining moment. He didn't repackage it for an anniversary special or behind-the-scenes docuseries. He just let it be. That choice makes it sacred. If this glimpse into Ron Howard's hidden past struck a chord with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Which actor or director should we cover next? Drop your thoughts below and watch the next video on your screen to explore more forgotten Hollywood moments you were never meant to see.